Well, thank you so much for joining us. This year-long project on climate security in Oceania has been an adventure. We appreciate the Center's support for this project. It has been more difficult than any of us could have imagined with the COVID crisis emerging right in the middle of it, but we've persevered and we hope have delivered to you 4 reports and an executive summary that will prove useful in securing U.S. interests in the region and help the region itself. I should say without further ado that I'm the supervisor of the project, Dr. Josh Busby, at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. What we're going to do today is present the executive summary led by Caleb Ray, who will introduce the 4 reports, and then each of the reports will be discussed by representatives of the groups that wrote them, including Christopher Matos and Caleb on the Mapping Vulnerability Report, second on disaster risk reduction, where Harshal Zal going to be leading the discussion, a third on migration, where Aaron Wolfson and Andrew Roberson will be talking, and then finally the last one on the strategic landscape in the region, in which Charlotte Gorman and Grace Fraser will be discussing that report. So without further ado, I'll turn it to them.
Thank you, Dr. Busby. My name is Caleb Ray, and I'm going to talk to you about the general executive summaries and introductions to those 4 reports. To start, I want to talk about the scope of our study area. So while we're studying Oceania, it's a limited definition. Particularly in the scope of our project, we have 20 small island polities, roughly 2 to 3 million people, about 1,300 islands. And those are both estimates. The exact numbers are difficult to ascertain. And notably outside of the scope of our project are New Zealand, Australia, and Papua New Guinea. Those countries are the largest, the most economically well-off, and the most populous countries in the region, and they just face an entirely different set of vulnerability factors than those 20 small island polities in our study area. So we excluded them. They're excluded. Just to give a sense of relative scale so we understand the island area we're talking about, it's got a land area about the size of Indiana, spread out over an area of North America, with exclusive economic zones spread out over an area of North America. So a relatively small chunk of land over a giant area of the ocean. And Dr. Busby, next slide, please. Also wanted to introduce a relevance of our research and our research question. So our research question is, what climate security risks exist? What's the current state of disaster preparedness? And how can the U.S., through U.S. Indo-PACOM and the Center for Excellence with Disaster Management, act to address that climate vulnerability in Oceania? Also, the region relevant right now due to an increasing strategic importance. Increasing Chinese presence in the region combined with existing American assets makes it important for the United States right now. And it's one of the most vulnerable regions in the world to climate change. A combination of island geography, there are a bunch of low-lying islands, predominantly low-lying islands that are vulnerable to, say, sea level rise. Variable state capacity, so states often don't have the ability to help themselves in case of disaster or to prepare for disasters. And then remoteness, so if something does go wrong, it's hard to get aid in or out. And then next slide, Dr. Busby, perfect. So to accomplish our research, answer our research question, we have 4 distinct reports. In the Mapping Vulnerability Report, we provide a series of maps to highlight climate-related vulnerability and recommend fixing some key data deficiencies to enable for more effective comprehensive planning. In the Disaster Risk Reduction Report, we combine existing risk assessments to produce and present both regional and country-specific risk profiles and recommend mitigation efforts accordingly. Then, in the Mitigation Report, we explore climate change as a cause of the decision to migrate and provide recommendations to mitigate the consequences of that migration in Oceania. And then finally, in the Political Security and Climate Landscape Report, we present the regional geopolitical situation. We recommend increasing generally American leadership on climate change, and we outline specific tools the United States and the U.S. Indo-PACOM and the Center can use to deepen that regional engagement while specifically focused on climate and development interests here. Next slide. While we did provide 4 distinct reports, we noticed some commonalities, and I want to talk about them to unify those reports. So first, generally an increasing vulnerability to climate change in our study area. As climate change progresses, climate hazards are likely to become worse. That means sea levels are likely to rise, storms are likely to be more common, and they're more likely to be severe. So there's more exposure to climate-related hazards. As exposure increases, particularly combined with the limited capacity in our study area, that exposure is more likely to lead to disasters, and those disasters are more likely to be very large. So the region is increasingly vulnerable. There are also some generally inherent challenges to working there. So given that relatively small landmass and population spread out over such a large part of the ocean, the region's size, scope, and disperseness is just difficult to work in. It's difficult to get to some of these islands. It's difficult to comprehensively plan for risk. And it's important because each island, due to a unique set of geologic, geographic, demographic, political, economic circumstances, has a unique risk profile that you really have to understand in order to effectively plan for risk in the region, which is a challenge when you don't have that data. Finally, mechanisms that lead to climate hazards, that lead climate hazards to cause negative security outcomes are generally complicated and hard to precisely identify. And while we recognize that vulnerability is increasing as a result of climate change, the complex web that leads to those potential negative security outcomes is likely to become more complex. And so waiting to act because we don't know those exact causal mechanisms is not the best idea. Rather, we should act now because uncertainty is likely to increase, and acting now can decrease in the future. And then last slide. To that end, to provide avenues for action, we have 3 general buckets of recommendations, and I'll let the groups get into the more specifics. But first, we recommend collecting information so that we can actually create some of those comprehensive data sets that allows for risk planning in Oceania. Second, we recommend providing development assistance, training, and planning to help build those state capacities to both prepare for and respond to any potential climate hazards and disasters. And then finally, we recommend diplomatic engagement now so that if those climate hazards do lead to complex disasters, we are in a position where we can help them respond, both ideally plan for and respond to any issues that arise, any negative security outcomes. And I will hand it over to Chris to present the mapping group findings.
Hello. So my name is Chris. I worked with the mapping group to produce our map section of the paper. And I'm going to go a little bit about what we had. So we started off our mapping section with trying to understand the geology and geography of all the islands to account for the unique risk profiles that those island types would face. In particular, what we wanted to look at was the number of reef islands in the area because they're primarily composed of loose settlement. Their shorelines are shifting and dynamic, and they tend to be very, very low lying, which puts them at high risk of sea level rise, as well as at a high risk of saltwater intrusion due to changing water patterns or seafloor patterns and wave patterns, threatening their freshwater reservoirs. So if we go to the next slide, thank you. We did then, using some of these geological profiles, we began to build a coastal flooding model. And so we used some of the highest resolution that was freely available via satellite to create a sort of comprehensive digital elevation models of areas within 1 meter of mean sea level rise, which is the sea level rise that is projected to happen by 2050. We then got these following estimates using a combination of NASA CDAC or socioeconomic data and satellite population estimation data. Approximately 18% or 480,000 people live within the 1 meter elevation sea level rise, including 90% of the populations of Tuvalu and the Marshall Islands, as well as nearly 50% of Tuvalu. We tried to approach this from a comprehensive regional perspective, but with that comes a set of weaknesses. We lack accurate bathymetry data to account for how the seafloor might change the aspects of island flooding, and there are large coastal areas relative to the low elevations that satellite imagery doesn't exactly align with. So there is some degree of error right now with using the current freely available systems. Next slide. We then decided to look at the infrastructure that would be vulnerable to coastal flooding because these by and large will help gauge an island's ability to respond and also their economic security in the future. A real problem here was access to data. So we restricted it to what was the data that was readily available in terms of both islands and the types of infrastructure we could find. So with that, we're just looking at Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Tuvalu, and Tonga. We discovered that while all of them were generally affected, there were disproportionate impacts within the islands on different types of infrastructure and islands within these nations. So the Solomon Islands, for example, stood to lose approximately a third of all of its airports. But, and if we could go to the next slide, please. On Fiji, as you can see on Lavani, which is the upper right little box with all the red in it, it stands to lose pretty much all of its power supply and medical infrastructure as a result of 1 meter sea level rise. So there's disproportionate impact within island nations. Next slide. And as we were exploring, we realized the extent of what we could project and what we needed and what definitely needed to be found out. Most important of this is informal settlements. The images here describe the difficulty in identifying informal settlements. The top represents a ground truth with pink. The bottom is a satellite image where you can see a lot of greenery. These informal settlements are important because they're unplanned residential areas on the periphery. They're often poor housing. They appear to be rapidly growing. They're not readily findable on maps, and they don't have a lot of the formal city development. We also think that there are additional remote sensing methods that might be out there or available to improve some of the geological and geography and shoreline data that we could get, including high resolution satellite data, but also improvements in bathymetry collection. And we also think saltwater intrusion is incredibly important. It was difficult. We couldn't generally build an at-large profile for saltwater intrusion because it requires a high degree of island lithology and geology, as well as the local oceanography. But there are islands that will be more at risk of saltwater intrusion into their freshwater reserves. And these should be done on a case-by-case basis, whether it be economic or most at risk of flooding. And then the last thing is the collection of more and more data. There are severe gaps in our data, including demographic infrastructure and hard sciences, particularly bathymetry data. The development and maintenance of data sets over time would be really helpful to understanding the long-term threats. And with that, I will hand it off.
Terrific. We'll now turn to Harshal Zalke to talk about the disaster risk reduction report.
Hi, everyone. I'm Harshal. I work with the disaster risk reduction team. Our research goal for this project was to understand Oceania's climate preparedness and vulnerability. We started by first looking at the existing indices and how do they rate countries' vulnerability. So in front of you, we have visualized the vulnerability ratings of Oceania countries as indicated by existing indices. So as you can see, there is a lot of variation in how indices estimate vulnerabilities. For example, in these maps, red color indicates high vulnerability and green indicates low vulnerability. So you can see across these four indices, there is a lot of variation. So now this brought us to the question of how we define vulnerability, and hence we decided to form our own metric so as to estimate the vulnerability of Oceania countries. Can we go on to the next slide, please, Dr. Basli? Yes. So we decided that we should measure vulnerability by measuring three factors. So the first one is the hazard exposure. The second one is the population exposure, and the third one is government preparedness. So for measuring hazard exposure, we relied on the existing indices, and we arrived at an ordinal scale of high, medium, and low hazard exposure for a country based upon the metrics for all the current indices. For measuring population exposure, we were interested in finding out what percentage of the population is exposed to any natural disaster or hazard. So for this, we looked at what is the percentage of population that lives within a particular distance of the coastline. We selected 1 kilometer, and that lives at a certain elevation. Again, the countries were rated on a scale of high, medium, and low. Finally, we also decided to factor in the government preparedness. So what are the government measures to help mitigate the effects of natural disasters? Now, even this is measured on a scale of high, medium, and low. However, high government preparedness is a good thing. Moving on to the next slide, Dr. Basbi. Yeah. So based on these three factors, we were able to rate the countries on their overall vulnerability score. We were able to rate them on, again, high, medium, and low. As you can see, most of the countries in Oceania have a vulnerability score of high and medium. This is owing to the fact that most of them have a high natural hazard exposure and a high population exposure. The only thing that differentiates whether a country would be in the high vulnerability, whether a country will be high vulnerable or medium vulnerable is decided upon by the government preparedness. For example, governments of Fiji and Kiribati are highly prepared. Hence, their vulnerability is medium as compared to Micronesia that has a high vulnerability. Based upon our findings, we formulate a set of recommendations. So we decided to have two categories of recommendation: one for the Oceania countries, and the other for the supporting actors active in this region. For Oceania countries, our prime recommendation is a recognition of differences, the difference between slow onset and swift onset hazards. We could not, in our study, we could not find any such distinction. And the most important is an increase in investment in implementation, training, capacity. We found that what has been reported in Hyogo and Sendai frameworks is a lot of times different from the ground infrastructure. For the supporting actors, so the primary recommendation would be to beware of using, be cautious about using the current indices, as there's a lot of variation in how they define vulnerability and preparedness. Also, there should be a clear funding strategy that aimed to build up adaptation in Oceania countries. So one example of this is the USAID READY project that works with government partners to build adaptation and fund adaptation projects. With this, I hand it over to the next group.
Terrific. Andrew and Aaron will take us through the migration report.
All right, thanks, Dr. Busby. And thank you all for being here first thing in the morning, Honolulu time. I know that's a little early to get into a deep dive into this topic, but thank you nonetheless. So again, my name is Andrew. I had the chance to work alongside with the other members of the migration group for the class. So with a better understanding of the issues presented by the mapping and DRR groups, I wanted to just note how our group focused a bit more on gathering and understanding of the relationship between climate change, natural disasters, and Oceania more broadly. We wanted to investigate how behaviors and attitudes towards migration in the wake of these threats differ across countries within the region. And we were also interested in gathering a better understanding of how migration might impact resettlement countries once people end up moving in the wake of these disasters. But in that vein, while it's sort of easy to make an initial connection from climate change induced natural disasters to a potential increase in migration, it's also important to understand that migration, both in the context of Oceania and more broadly across the world, is really driven by a broad set of factors. Which is why I thought it would be really interesting and important to include the diagram here, which was pulled from the Republic of Vanuatu's national policy paper on climate change and disaster-induced displacement. And so as you can see, there's a wide variety of triggers that might lead someone to move away from their home and seek resettlement in another place. It's not necessarily how it's sometimes framed in terms of climate migration, in terms of just a sudden onset disaster. There's a whole spectrum of factors that could leave one to move from their home. And so as such, it's really incredibly difficult to isolate migration that occurs solely for so-called climate change reasons, given the fact that changes in climate affect such a broad set of considerations for people in Oceania in particular. Nevertheless, it's important to understand how climate change might impact movement throughout the region in general. Next slide, please. So with over 20 polities in the region, it's pretty difficult to fully understand the nuances of each state's considerations with respect to migration. So during the course of our research process, we had the chance to conduct interviews with members of the United Nations Trust Fund for Human Security, among some other officials in this policy area, which really helped us to identify 5 countries that would be the most likely, quote, sending countries in the wake of increased migration from the region. We chose these countries not only given the immediate risks to populations that were identified by the mapping and DRR groups, but also because of other socioeconomic factors that might be exacerbated in the wake of these either slow onset disasters or the more quickly impactful disasters that we may see. And so as such, for the purposes of our analysis, we identified Kiribati, the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and Fiji, not in any particular order, to be the most likely sending countries under this framework. Next slide, please.
So in our study of migration, we assume 3 different types of migration. Number 1 is international migration from an outlying island to a more resilient island within a state or territory. Number 2 is intra-regional migration from one state or territory to another within Oceania. And number 3 is extra-regional migration from Oceania to states outside the region. For this presentation, we're going to focus on extra-regional migration, although there is a stated preference among specific populations to migrate internationally or intra-regionally when possible. There are 4 main states that are likely to absorb the populations of Oceania: Australia, New Zealand, France, and US. This assumption is largely based on existing legal avenues of migration from the islands to the assumed host states and the roles of extant diaspora populations in those states. These legal avenues of migration differ significantly between states. People in the US and French territories, for instance, have citizenship, and the US also has existing, albeit expiring, compacts of free association with a number of states in the region that allow residents in the mainland US, but not citizenship. Australia and New Zealand have the least direct avenues for migration in terms of citizenship, although both have extensive work visa programs that allow migration. Legal ties do not cover the entire scope of immigration from Oceania. However, for instance, Colombia is the 3rd most common extra-regional host of migrants from Vanuatu, Russia the 2nd for Tuvalu. An important aspect of extra-regional migration that is often ignored is the likely reception of migrants in host states. All 4 of the identified most likely host states have recent anti-immigration movements that impact the ability of Pacifica to migrate. However, most anti-immigration movements within these states are based on perceptions of threat to national stability based on ethno-religious identities of the migrants. Pacifica are likely to avoid these ethno-religious concerns, but may face resistance due to other issues such as the perception of competition over limited economic opportunities. As such, immigration from Oceania needs to be understood as a 2-way street. The host states must understand the domestic concerns within their states and be willing to provide Pacifica with avenues to employment that limit such domestic concerns over immigration. Can we move to the next slide, please? So the migration group had 5 recommendations in the context of a managed retreat or forced migration. Recommendations 1 and 2 regard increased diplomatic presence of the US in the region. Number 3 has been mentioned before, it's the COFA agreements. Of note is recommendation number 4, which will allow maintained access to the region at lower cost to the US. In the context of the recent restructuring of the Marine Corps and to a lesser extent the Navy, supportive key allies will provide access to territories that may limit the tyranny of distance represented by the vast ocean of Oceania. And number 5 also goes over some of our lack of data that the that the mapping group covered earlier. And with that, I'd like to return it to Dr. Busby.
Perfect. We'll turn it now to Grace Fraser and Charlotte Gorman to talk and walk us through the strategic landscape paper.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Dr. Busby. Our research question really focused on what are the geostrategic complexities, risks, and opportunities regarding climate security issues in Oceania. And in the absence of field work, we chose to do a stakeholder analysis of both the United States and Oceania, as they are the most pressing members of our paper. and other important actors in the region, including China, Japan, and then Australia, New Zealand, and France, both due to their territorial claims in the region and their participation in agreements such as the Franz Agreement. Next slide, please. We've chosen to include this map just as a visualization of US assets in Oceania, both looking at US territories and Hawaii, which is part of the United States, and to visualize where US military installations are, so that we can compare it to our next slide, which clarifies Chinese assets in Oceania. We found this to be notable because we not only indicate Chinese military installations in red, but also countries that are indebted to China with those yellow dots. We see that increasing in the past few years. Additionally, we wanted to include which countries recognize Taipei, and more notably, which ones recognized Taipei up until 2019, and you can see that the Solomon Islands and Kiribati recently changed that stance. Throughout our research, we generally found that we had engagement from the US, France, Australia, and New Zealand due to territorial claims and the Franz Agreement and things of that nature, but that a lot of the independent states in Oceania operated through regional organizations, specifically the Pacific Islands Forum, when addressing climate concerns and climate resiliency, and that other regional organizations also work with both the Pacific Islands Forum and the University of the South Pacific, both for information gathering and training exercises for, not training exercises for in a military sense, but in disaster preparedness and disaster resiliency. And so those existing institutions have been how a lot of the independent states have chosen to address this. And the United States has sort of partnered with these organizations in the past. And with that, I will give it to Charlotte.
So as Grace described, our pursuit of the research question led us to formulate 14 separate policy recommendations, both relevant at the center level and then at the larger interagency context. So we've grouped them into these 5 general themes. So I'll just touch on them, but of course the detailed recommendations can be found in our report. So early warning and risk reduction, increased collaboration with existing partners and regional institutions, particularly the Franz Agreement is one point we hit on there, as well as the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration resources and other scientific capabilities that we're able to bring to bear to support the region. Economic investment, more pathways to access US resources for development, so whether that's USAID aid, US Development Finance Corporation, which is a new entity, and also looking at some of those trade and investment resources as well as explicit development aid to be able to play a smart role in the region given Chinese and other multilateral institutions' increased investment there. Diplomatic engagement, so renewed diplomatic attention to migration issues, trade, and security cooperation. So I mentioned there, which the migration group mentioned as well, the renewing of the compacts of free association, but also creating more pathways for residents in Oceania, particularly in those US-linked territories, but also in other island states to be able to connect with the US. Defense interests, which was a particular interest of ours, so there's several recommendations there. But just as a brief overview, firstly, to invest in protecting US assets in the region. That map Grace had, there is some significant US military resources there, but then also to continue working with regional partners and doing those operations and military exercises that we've been involved in, and to develop some Oceania specific programs. So I mentioned an Army program there, but there's a few other ideas. And then lastly, climate leadership. So looking forward, not only at the international level in terms of rejoining the Paris Agreement, but then supporting the Pacific Islands Forum institution in the region to support their ambitious climate change agenda and to prioritize climate leadership at the international and multilateral levels, because we've seen, looking at our stakeholder analysis, that states like France, who have really taken a strong stand on that issue, have been able to make inroads in a way that we think would be wise to consider moving forward. So with that, I'd like to turn back to Professor Busby to wrap up, and then we'd love to take your questions.
Terrific. Well, I'm just going to post the main categories of recommendations. which included information collection, development assistance, training and planning, and diplomatic engagement, which were sort of three channels, different channels that we thought of as ways that are cross-cutting all the reports. And as you heard from the various presentations, on some level we were limited in our ability to generate as much information based on the COVID crisis interfering with travel plans. But even still, notwithstanding a general problem of the region, given its remoteness and capacity constraints, is its ability to kind of be self-aware, situationally aware, both internally, but also for external observers like the United States. So here there's a role to play in helping the region have a better sense of its own vulnerabilities. And then following on from that, a variety of ways through capacity building that we can talk in more detail in the Q&A about some specific modalities for enhancing that, but considerable technical assistance in building upon that awareness of vulnerability to help ward off threats and be ready for them. And then the last is, what's come out across all of the various papers is enhanced diplomatic engagement from the US, given the region's prioritization of climate change at the strategic level. That means ultimately some change in the US conversation about climate change, but there are some other very specific avenues that we identified, such as a possible State Department strategic dialogue with the Pacific Islands Forum that may be ways to enhance US diplomatic engagement. And there may be more prosaic ways for the center to enhance its own presence, say in Fiji, with maybe a local liaison. And I should note that a number of the ideas that came to us as we developed this set of recommendations were vastly enhanced by your former colleague, Adrian Duane, who was invaluable in helping us try and sharpen the more operational guidance throughout this process that we tried to come through with these recommendations. And aside from this, I'll send some additional ideas that he developed in concert with us that may help you build upon these in a more concrete way. But I'll stop there and open it up to questions. So thank you so much for this opportunity, and look forward to your questions and concerns.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to Mo for just a second, because I've got several things that I want to bring up conversation-wise, but I'm going to let him sort of start the conversation up. Thanks.
Sorry, I was muted. Great presentation, great stuff. Had a quick question. I was looking at the statement that you said for the risk analysis, that they either do not exist or are conflicting, or they're incomplete. Conflicting, I saw something with the mapping that you have like 4 different agencies, you got 4 different indicators and stuff. So can you elaborate a little bit more on the conflicting and how can we overcome that, or maybe perhaps mitigate that, or look at a mitigation plan? Over. I'm sorry, that's military term.
Harshal, do you want to take
I'm happy to.
Or who else wants to? I thought that might be a DRR question, but let's go to Harshal first and then Caleb.
Great. Harshal, you're on mute.
Yeah, Dr. Buzz, can you go on to the mappings, the maps, like that slide?
Sure.
Yes. So when we were doing the study, what we realized is that all of these indices, they define vulnerability differently. So like WRI, CRI, NDK, and INFORM. Also, so when they look at vulnerability, a lot of times, the factors that they consider are different. So some of them might consider, for example, social conflicts or like internal government problems as a vulnerability, whereas others may not. And hence, their overall vulnerability score is different. Going forward, what we feel like our recommendation would be to centers and any other research group studying this is to like not exactly limit, but to maybe like somehow give more weights to the actual like factors such as disaster, uh, the probability or like the hazard exposure, as we mentioned, and also like what is the percentage of population that will be affected in case such a disaster occurs. And hence, like our aim was to build like a metric considering these two as the primary factors, and also like government preparedness, how to mitigate that. So to give you like an example like of how these are different, just a second. Sorry. Yes. So the climate risk index considers economic, social, and natural hazards in computing its vulnerability, whereas the informs it does not take into account the economic factors of a country. It only considers social, natural hazards and government. Similarly, ND gain index, it only takes into account the economic and social factors. It doesn't consider the hazard factor. So these are the kinds of differences that result in different vulnerability scores.
Caleb, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so I was part of the mapping group. So in writing that, particularly what I was thinking, there was a conflicting risk analysis, vulnerability analysis on the same information with the same data we used that found far fewer people at risk for 2050 than we did currently. And there are a set of factors that go into that. So one, even those guys use the same. It's the Climate Central. They use the same data that we did, but they used a different They use the same coastal data that we did, but they use different population estimates. And so those population estimates based on that NASA CDAC gridded population led us to different results. And so one of the big things that we recommend is working to create a unified data set that we think is accurate. Because even the NASA CDAC data, we had some questions of how accurate it was. It would show populations in the middle of the ocean occasionally. It would show islands with no population at all, where we know it would show some islands with much lower population than they would find on the census that was published 10 years ago. And so one of the big things we recommend is actually working on, particularly for elevation data, seafloor topography, and population, creating those data sets remotely and doing some truthing to make sure that that we think spot check in important places are accurate, and then having those be the authoritative, comprehensive source of data rather than having conflicting population estimates from different U.S. agencies, different private agencies, and then having those estimates used in a broad combination of ways that lead you to paint entirely different pictures of vulnerability. So we addressed it in our paper, but there's one paper that specifically looks at saltwater intrusion and uses saltwater intrusion on one of the Marshall Islands and says that many islands will be uninhabitable at 2050. And that directly conflicts with what we found. But saltwater intrusion information based on seafloor topography data doesn't exist in the region at all. So it's incredibly difficult to say whether or not our analysis is closer or their analysis is closer, just because we really can't assess beyond their specific Marshall Island example. Does that answer your question?
Oh, yeah, it's pretty good. Yeah, because sometimes, it's everything with statistics like data. And I think it was Mark Twain that said, there's a liar, big fat liar, then there's statisticians. So it was good to put these together, and you can get an idea that you got to, when you're creating frameworks or mitigation plans or training, to take consideration what is the data that's being presented. And go ahead, sir. I got another question, but I'll let you jump in.
Well, so I'm probably going to take quite a few minutes up here for a second, so bear with me. But I was a math and statistics major in my undergrad, so thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mo.
Yeah.
It lets me know where I sit sort of in the food chain. I also, just from a personal perspective, I may be able to stay on well past 10 o'clock, so if this goes beyond 10 and everybody has time, I'm not opposed to that. But I am at home and do have a personal appointment that's supposed to be here at 10 o'clock. but that's 10 o'clock Hawaii time. So that could be anywhere from 10 to 1. It just depends on how it plays out. But let me so if I hop off, basically it'll be reverted back to Mo when this happens. So please don't be offended by any of that, but let's make the most use of the time we have left. And to that end, I just make a couple observations. One is, into the current administration and the way that the world is looked at, clearly you guys have a pretty good understanding of what the current vision or view is of climate change. And I think that you've done a very good job in managing that and still providing a solid set of recommendations, partly because I think it can kind of play both ways. Is that cautious skepticism is not necessarily a bad thing, and over aggressive downerism, the whole world's coming to an end, can also be a negative thing. So balance, I think you've done a good job in balancing those two things together. I do have some interest, and I'll share sort of as I go through each of the topics, in figuring out how do we share this information best. So each of you have done, within the 4 reports in the executive summary, a remarkable job in producing a very useful product. One of the things that we told Josh when we started this is that if I can get 1 or 2 or 3 actionable things from my center out of these reports, then this is a successful endeavor, and we've by far exceeded that expectation. What I also see, though, and I'll talk specifically to a couple, is the opportunity to take this and plant these someplace else. So there's been significant discussions on USAID's involvement and the international community and PIF and others. If your report you think needs to be pushed someplace and you have targets of opportunity, simply let us know who that is, because I'm pretty fearless in my willingness to send things out to others who may otherwise not ask for unsolicited inputs to their personal problems. I do want to start quickly on the mapping things. One of the challenges that you described is sort of the data collection. That is incredibly expensive to do. So to get the bathymetry data and the island data and the rest of that, to make that accurate, is super expensive. So there's some significant challenges in that. But what I will tell you is I'm going to do this. So it's Chris and Caleb, I think, were the 2 that were identified to me, but there's probably more. That report will be provided in its entirety to the Pacific Office Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So I'm going to personally give it to the commanders and 1-star general and say, you guys need to look at this, because as you look at Oceania issues, these are the gaps that exist within that data set, that if you can help to populate them, then you can enable other people to solve the problems. Plus, Corps of Engineers, generally speaking, has a ton of money. To Harshal and whoever are the rest of the folks on the DRR side, I think that your presentation was excellent. And
we lost your audio.
Damn auto mute. So Harshal, hopefully you heard that part. It's doing a great job. But I think your portion was probably the most affected by the inability to travel. And I say that because you need to contextualize what you're talking about. And what that means, so we as outsiders very well can look into Oceania and see what we see as problems through our lenses, right? And we can run data and we can look at things through our perspective. But until you talk to the director of the NDMO in a given country, or you talk to the police departments, or you talk to the health community, or et cetera, is the standards by which they consider things to be acceptable may be significantly different than Western standards, so to speak, and certainly even in and amongst the islands. There was a conversation, or one of the charts that talks about how almost all of the countries are high for natural hazards exposure. I will look through the report again to see that, but I think and you can jump in and correct me, some of that had to do with some of the slow onset climate change based things. So for example, Nauru is not a high risk country for natural disasters. It's too close to the equator. It doesn't get affected by storms, and very rarely does it get affected by any sort of earthquake type activity, but it could be severely affected by the climate change piece. So again, for the seawater and, tide levels and all the rest of those things. So the point being is that in grouping things, we sometimes lose the uniqueness of those things. Mm-hmm. And it goes to a quote that's just kind of one of my favorites, is that, all models are wrong. Some are just more useful than others. So a model that applies extremely well here may not work there, but kind of keep those things in mind. But otherwise, I thought that was really remarkable. The migration one, you know, I wrote this down and I'm going to basically read it to you. It says, basically super informative, and I've never seen anything this comprehensive. If that report does not get published as a standalone informative document, then the world has come to a crushing end, because there is no other single source that I can think of that describes at a minimum, the migration opportunities and legal ramifications for those different groups and those different islands and where they would typically go and the rest of those things. That product will be provided very specifically to the Oceania team up at Indo-PACOM, and then I also want to share it to the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies, because I think that an awareness of the legal ramifications and implications and migratory workers and all the rest of those things that you guys talked about in one consolidated document is pretty freaking cool, which is a scientific term for somebody who didn't go to the LBJ school. So, and then to Grace and I think it's Charlie for the politics side, same thing as the level to which, first of all, yours was like super long. So you guys got to work on that. That was awesome. But the lessons in it applied directly to what the director of strategy, so the J5 at Indo-PACOM, thinks about. And you did I think, going back to sort of the discussion with Harshal, is you've done a great job of sort of breaking that out by country and to areas of interest, so that can be shared, I think, and used pretty broadly. My final comment that I will have is that in that one in particular and in others, it's very easy to see where practitioners, so Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Special Operations, Coast Guard, et cetera, can take pieces of this and say, how can I, and you know, I'll just be honest with you, how can I use this information to better counter China's influence in Oceania? You know, sort of short story, long story, but I've been at Indo-Pacific Command since 2013. I've been at the center since 2014. Again, this is my third commander. And the first two both said, hey, we really want to have a stronger impact and influence in Oceania. And about 6 weeks into their command, usually the world took over their brain. Somebody in North Korea did something stupid. Somebody in China did something stupid. And Oceania had to fall off of the important meter. So when Admiral Davidson got there, he said, hey, Oceania is super important to me. And truthfully, we're just like going, okay, well, let's see how long this lasts, right? Because you only have so much bandwidth and capacity. The fact is that almost 2 years later, I think his 2-year point is coming up in about a week, he is still extremely focused on this because of that ability to affect the battle space, for lack of a better phrase, and how do you find, discover, uncover, and react to or proact to the influences of malign forces like China in Oceania. And then the timing on the COVID stuff, I mean, has really amplified that messaging to the command and I think to the world. So the products that you guys created are going to be extremely useful. We'll put them to work right away. One of the things I got to get with Mo on and say, okay, I'm trying to remember who had the DRR training. That might have been Harshal.
Yes.
That is a place in which we are very specifically capable of solving problems. So that's kind of what we do. So that's going to be a ton of fun to see if we can get into it. But it goes back to the cultural discussion is, yes, but how do you train culturally appropriately in Oceania? Because it's not like going to Western Europe, you know, and putting people around a room. There's a lot of kava that's going to get drank someplace at some point, you know, as soon as you hit the country of Fiji. So hopefully we all get a chance to do that at some point. But those are sort of my thoughts to you guys. And if anybody has any of those topics that they want to amplify, I'm all ears, at least for the next little bit.
Well, I'm a shameless self-promoter when it comes to getting the work out there via social media. So I'll endeavor to get that out there, but hopefully we can give you some additional focused ideas of what other partners would want to hear this work. And we've certainly met a number of different institutions, whether it's the Lowy Institute in Australia or others that would likely be welcome recipients of it. But for any of the substantive concerns, any members of the team want to jump in with any responses to questions, concerns Director Martin has raised? One of the interesting things that having done vulnerability studies like this for 10 years is Mo alluded to this as sort of lies, damn lies, and statistics. And another way of thinking about it is sort of the challenge of models is garbage in, garbage out. And one of the main preoccupations, particularly the mapping group, I think, was to ensure that we were, and I think it's also true of the DRR group, is not to just accept existing methodologies as the necessarily true representation of the underlying phenomena. And I think this is always a general challenge of modeling and at a distance. And that was the real tragedy of not ultimately being able to do the ground truthing to verify whether the things that we'd come up with sort of in the lab remotely were what local actors perceived of as their vulnerabilities. And so that would be kind of follow-on work that, on some level we got in a position, particularly with the DRR group, to take something, and I think this is also true of the maps, take something to see if this jibes with local sensibilities. And to the extent that it doesn't, then that might mean, better data collection or alterations of the maps or more refined subnational analysis. And hopefully that's the kind of thing that even if we're not in a position to do that work, if there's another research group from us or Columbia or some other outlet, or if the center has its own resources to take the work and work with local partners. We had extensive conversations with folks at the University of the South Pacific who are extremely busy, but also welcoming. And we had gotten to the point, right before the COVID crisis happened, where we were ready to, have some interactions, not with just the University of South Pacific, but there were other universities in Fiji in particular. And I think that would be a tremendous opportunity to pick up on those connections that we've already made with Beth Holland or with Dr. Laco, whom Mo introduced us to, because I think they're willing partners. They have particular sensitivities of working with outsiders, given that, outsiders often come up and take their data and disappear. So I think that that's a real concern of how this kinds of external work can be useful to them. But I think that they are hungry for additional information. We'll certainly be sharing the work with them, but I hope that y'all will be in a position to take that work forward with them and say, okay, does this feel right? Where doesn't it feel right? Why doesn't it feel right in certain, because we know, like you said, all models are inaccurate. It's just how useful are they? And I think having the maps and the sort of observations as a point of departure, people can say, well, I disagree with your assessment of Fiji and here's why. And so on the DRR one in particular, one of the things that we tried to do is say, like, what would be the minimal things that you would expect a country that is doing good preparedness to have? Well, we hope that they are reporting under the Sendai framework. We hope that they have an office. And one of the indicators that we ultimately weren't able to collect as much information on is how much money per capita are they setting aside for this purpose. And so that's something that we didn't quite get as much traction on as we'd hoped, in part because that information isn't readily available, but I think a follow-on study could find. So other questions that y'all have for us? I mean, I know we've got technically 5 minutes, but we may be able to go a bit beyond that. Other questions that you have for us, or other observations from the team that you guys wanted to, any reflections?
I have a quick question.
No.
So one of the things the mapping group really wrestled with is how to effectively talk about, ideally show, and we really didn't get there, but discuss informal settlements. I think informal settlements present, talking about lack of data, we really couldn't find any comprehensive data outside of very specific information on informal settlements in, say, Suva, and there are a few. And they represent sort of a nexus of migration challenges, lack of information challenges, highly vulnerable because they tend to be in areas that are in that are naturally at risk to climate hazards because the cities aren't there. So I'm just curious, do you guys have any particular knowledge or engagement specifically around informal settlements, given that at least by the mapping group's analysis, there seems to be not much information out there on them across the region, but they seem to be particularly important for disaster, for climate hazard planning in the region?
I'm trying to think here, sir, but a lot of times when you're looking for the data, it's people don't like people looking in their hamper, you know, and that's the kind of stuff of that. But we can look into, I mean, once this has been established, and I think what Director Martin said, that if we share this, we may have some people that come up and say, hey, perhaps this is not correct, perhaps this is not correct. But I don't think there's anything that was there that was consolidated into one thing like you guys did. Is something that's really great. So now it's something that's written, something that we could share, and then we'll start getting the people to come in and say, hey, we can do this or we can do that. Or it could also trigger some kind of study like Director Martin was saying with the Corps of Engineers or with NOAA or somebody else can say, hey, you know, can we expound on this? We can expand on this. Can we look at it? But a lot of times it's difficult even on my side to get data because again, it's like people don't like people going into people's houses. Why are you going to use this data? Right. You know, why are you here? It's a funding year. It's a election year. It's some kind of year. But I think this would be the catalyst or the foundation is for people to come out and say, hey, this is incorrect. This is not correct. Let me show you why. And then we can expound on that. Anything, Director Martin? I'm not sure of you.
Yeah, so I'll add, you know, even in the state of Hawaii, we have those exact same issues. There are significant numbers of large homeless encampments, up to and including one that has sort of its own local government on the west side of the island, and rules and behaviors and all the rest of these things that simply are not included in the normal conversations about, you know, even, you know, a state in the United States. And I'm certain that those exist in other places. But I missed one thing earlier, which will hopefully help to address some of that, Caleb, is that Mo is going to be directed right now. So you better be writing this down.
Let me write it down. Write it down.
It's being recorded, so we'll play it back for you if you fail to comply.
Yeah.
To take these things, and I would say that is a very interesting observation, and incorporate those into our country books. Yes. And say, hey, within the demographics and the population of a country like Fiji or someplace in which we control sort of the narrative on it, is we need to have a section that talks about these undocumented settlements, you know, and we need to take some of the bathymetry, you know, questions and challenges and some of the infrastructure things. I mean, you guys have just provided a source document so that we can take the products that we create and make them better. And then those are really fun for us because they have their own feedback loop, is that they get provided to the country and the country teams, and then the country teams go, hey, wait a second, that's not quite right. And then they will seek out and bring you back better data than if you try and do just sort of a couple of grad students flying in the University of South Pacific and saying, you know, show me your books. So I think you're onto something. And I think there's ways that for what we do for a living, because that's meaningful. We go back to, I think it was the Ambe earthquake, Ambe volcano in Vanuatu.
Yes.
Yeah, so there's Ambe Island outside of Vanuatu. So after the cyclone a few years ago, this volcano was blown up and everything else. And basically the World Food Program and a bunch of others in the area were trying to figure out how to get these people off of this island because it was going to be basically completely consumed. And there weren't a whole lot of people in the country of Vanuatu who knew actually how many people lived on the island. So this is not like a new dynamic, but I think it is a place in which we can take this observation, this question, and turn it into, hey, how can we start sourcing some of that data? Because if you're doing evacuation planning, or if you're even doing urban planning, you want to have a pretty good idea of who's there and where. And if that satellite image, like you showed, only shows you a jungle, it doesn't show you the people living under the jungle, you know, then you missed the point. Maybe we should get some of those things from, you know, S.H.I.E.L.D. or Star Wars or something, kind of zoom in a little bit.
Yeah, I love S.H.I.E.L.D.
That's probably expensive too. So, okay, but thank you very much. That was awesome.
On that point of informal settlements, that was actually an idea that, you know, Beth Holland at the University of South Pacific said we could really use some help on because, you know, this isn't a region compared to some others that has as much hot conflict, but of the kinds of emergent sources of security challenges, the rise of informal settlements when you have people from different islands coming together, moving into pretty ramshackle housing that maybe have limited services and economic activity that are highly exposed to sort of climate effects could be the kinds of flashpoints, whether it's in Suva or Honiara, Port Vila, there are a whole host of places that they're known, but the sort of dynamics about the extent of the population, the geography, and their vulnerability. We tried to get some traction on it, and we think that there's some really low-cost remote sensing ways with using some of the machine learning. And we tried to, there's some prototypes that we mentioned in the report of how you could do this. When we tried to do some dry runs ourselves, it was hard to distinguish, informal settlement housing type roof structure, at least to train the machine learning technology to distinguish those kinds of roofs from more established housing. But I think that was, if we had a little bit more bandwidth and time with it, there are ways of doing that. And the US has better reconnaissance capabilities to do that at a resolution that we probably couldn't see with what was freely available to us. Maybe ways of using the remote capabilities of the US to try and train a machine to identify where those informal settlements are and then follow that up with more high cost, ground truthing in a few limited locations, but also to complement that with some better understanding of what the risks are of the sort of mixed populations that are moving into, because there are only a handful of places that are high concentration population centers like the ones that I mentioned in Suva, Honiara, Port Vila. There's also one in Papua New Guinea as well that's like this, that I think could be, really important sites for thinking about future climate security challenges where they really come together. Anyway, I just wanted to say a little bit more about that. I know we've gone a little bit over time, but it sounds like your home visit hasn't happened yet, so we may have a little bit extra bandwidth. Additional comments, queries, or follow-up from the team of things that you say?
Yeah, I want to respond and just correct you briefly. Actually, sometimes with the existing resolution of satellite imagery, there are effective machine learning algorithms to identify informal settlements. There was a really interesting study where they mapped the major slum Kibera, the major slum in Kenya, Nairobi, very accurately, and I think we include this in our paper. But I think we just didn't have the bandwidth, or to be honest, the statistical capacity to run machine learning algorithms on satellite imagery because we're a bunch of policy students that can't do that. Or at least couldn't do that in the time frame we had. So I think there are more immediate opportunities than requiring 3 meter resolution satellite imagery to work on some of these things, which probably makes it cheaper, or at least I assume.
Cool. Did Charlotte have a question? She had that look. No, it was just waving.
Other final considerations from the team? Any other observations?
I think they're tied, and this is like the final requirement for their grade, I'm assuming.
Well, the grades were filed this morning, so this is like extra credit in the afterlife.
Oh, okay. We don't forget, we need to take a photo with everybody in the Brady Bunch style.
So I did a couple of them already.
Okay.
But those were when people weren't actually smiling then, so I could do a more formal one now if we're ready for.
Do the 1, 2, 3 thing. So.
Okay, are ready? 1, 2, 3. All right, I'll do another one. Okay, terrific. Well, it was a challenging year for all of us, and one of my main aspirations that was somewhat left unfulfilled, which was the travel piece, and yet, despite it all, I hope created some valuable information for you and for the region that will serve both you, the U.S. government, and the region well, given the severity of these challenges. So I'm delighted that the students were able to pull this off the travel challenges notwithstanding. And I'm glad we were able to present them to you today. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yes. And if we could get if it's possible to get a copy of the briefing that you presented today.
Yeah, and so Zoom will create both a video and a transcript of this, and so we'll be able to circulate that as well. And then we may have a few tweaks. A couple of the papers we noticed, we fixed one typo. There might be another small change coming, but we'll send that to you. And we've got a full Dropbox folder where all the final versions will be housed. But again, on behalf of the University of Texas and the LBJ School, I want to thank you guys again for the opportunity to do this work. And hopefully we can continue productive relationships and conversations from here on.
Absolutely. Anything from you, Director Martin? Or
That's it. No, thank you guys very much, and enjoy whatever's left of your day.
okay, take care.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Don't forget to send me that picture.
All right, will do. Thank you guys.
Thank
Thanks
you.
all of you. And I want to thank the students for their
you.
terrific
Thank
hard
you.
work and perseverance. You guys
Thank
are
you, guys.
champions.
Hey, and stay in touch, students. We're not, just because we ended this doesn't mean you don't have family in Hawaii. If you ever need anything, letters of recommendations or additional work, you're doing your work, or you need some data, some methodologies, some interviewees, you let us know, okay?
I was just going to say, I think we all have a special place in our heart for Oceania. And even though we didn't make it this year, I have a feeling we'll get out there at some point.
Oh, yeah, that's good. All right. You guys take care. Enjoy the Memorial Day weekend.
All right.
Thank you.
And congratulations for those who are going to graduate.
All right.
Yay.
Thank
All right,
you.
Dr. Busby. You take care there, Josh.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Mo. Thanks so much.
Okay, you take care, guys.
All right. Bye, guys.